What is life like at home while the battles are being fought in the Pacific against the Japanese and in Europe against the Nazis and the fascist Italians? Well, I want you to add now, go back. I want you to go back now to the objectives and add these two objectives towards the top of that first top piece of paper. There are two more objectives that I'm going to talk about here in the next 20-some minutes. I'm going to explain the ways mobilization for war affected Americans. So that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit. And then on the back side of the handout, I've left most of the space to talk about the second objective, really the third objective if you're counting, and that is to explain what were the impacts of World War II on minority groups, various minority groups. And I've highlighted 4 or 5 of those minority groups on the back side. So that's going to be my task here now for the next 20 or so minutes, is to convey the home front to you. And as you can see on the second half of the first page, I'm going to define what mobilization is for you, and we're going to talk about what this mobilization was and how it's going to affect Americans. So there should be some space there for you to write down the following. That when we talk about mobilization, basically what we're talking about is transforming the economy from a consumer-based economy where peacetime consumer goods are being created by factories, transforming that to a wartime economy to where now war materials are being created. Once war officially begins and the United States starts to prepare for war, it's going to start producing a lot less consumer items, and it's going to, of course, try to emphasize war production instead. Enough ships, enough airplanes, enough tanks, enough war material. Let me give you a couple stats. And this picture shows just how dramatically fast this transformation is going to take place. Before the war, American factories were producing like 3 million cars. Do you know how many cars are going to be produced from like 1940, 41 through 1945, knowing that 3 million cars had been produced prior to that? 200. So think about that. Going from 3 million cars being produced by these car manufacturing companies and all of a sudden down to 200 over a 4-year period. That's a dramatic transformation. And so converting from that peacetime economy to a wartime economy is this mobilization I want you to write down in your notes, where the government now is going to tell these companies, look, we're going to make some kind of contractual deals with you, but we don't want you creating consumer goods for the American consumer. We want you to transform your factories into now wartime production and making goods for the war and for the military, and not just our military, but for the British military and for the Soviet military. We're going to supply all the Allied weaponry as much as we can for the war. Now that means something. That means unemployment, which had been high during the Great Depression, is now going to almost cease to exist. There's going to be plenty of jobs now, because now these factories are going to be building war materials for the United States government. The United States government is buying all this war material, and these factories need workers. And so you go from an unemployment problem in the Depression to now around 2% or less, which is, of course, wonderful statistics when it comes to unemployment. So basically it brings that whole Great Depression unemployment jobless problem to a halt because of wartime production. So the economy is booming. There's jobs available. There's companies making money because of these contracts with the federal government. You now have a federal government who's very much involved in these productions of goods and telling raw materials that, yes, these raw materials like steel and nylon and rubber are going to go here and not to the consumer-based economy companies over here. It's going to be very much hands-on. So there is this mobilization as one part. But then there's space for you to write down the next thing about what's happening in America.
In 1941, more than 3 million cars had been manufactured in the United States. Only 139 more were made during the entire war. Instead, Chrysler made fuselages, General Motors made airplane engines, guns, trucks, and tanks. And at its vast Willow Run plant in Ypsilanti, Michigan, 67 acres of assembly lines under a single roof that one observer called the Grand Canyon of the mechanized world. The Ford Motor Company performed something like a miracle, 24 hours a day. The average Ford car had some 15,000 parts. The B-24 Liberator long-range bomber had 1,550,000 parts. One came off the line at Willow Run every 63 minutes.
Think about that. Every 63 minutes you had some of these bombers coming out of the assembly line. So they were able to transition from a peacetime economy into a wartime economy in an unbelievable amount of time and then produce so many war goods for the Allies that they just, of course, were able to overpower both the Japanese in the Pacific and, of course, the Nazis and the Italian fascists in Europe. But then, of course, the question is, how do you pay for all this? Where's all this money coming from that the federal government is buying all this stuff from these private companies or starting up these factories? The idea is this. You pay for it in two ways. Number one, you raise taxes. That's a give me, right? You raise income taxes specifically. Income taxes are going to be dramatically increased. That's one part of the war. About half of the war is paid out of taxes. The other half of the war is paid for, as you can see by these images and by what you see pictured there, right there in the center of the screen. They're going to borrow money by selling bonds. So please, in your notes, somehow you have to put down borrowing money, selling bonds. They're going to be called war bonds. You're going to try to encourage people to buy a war bond. Now, what is a war bond? Basically, it's an agreement. Here, government, here's some money. And then in 10 years, you'll pay me back how much I gave you plus interest. The famous one here would be a $25 bond right here. At face value, you paid only $12.50 for it. But then in 10 years, you'd get 25. So basically, you get the money that you lent to the United States government, plus you doubled your money by all the interest the government was going to promise you. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, the way the government paid for half of the war is they tried to communicate to the American public that they were going to do their diligence, to do their patriotic good by lending money to the government. And so you had these bond drives and you had all this propaganda to go ahead and buy war bonds, help the government win by lending this government the money that needs to defeat the enemy. So half of it was borrowed and half of it was paid for by increasing taxes. And if you put those down, you should have a pretty good sense of how the war was going to be paid for. Increasing income taxes and selling war bonds, or basically borrowing money by having the government issue these bonds and the government then paying interest on these bonds. But then you have another issue. How do you make sure there's enough goods for the military and for the soldiers without driving up prices for all the civilian population back at home? Because you're going to have to feed these soldiers, and you might, of course, not have enough to go around. How do you prevent spikes in prices and inflation? And please, hopefully, write down in your notes that the government is very much worried about inflation, prices going way up in a short period of time. So what they tried to do to get the American public not to hoard and not to drive up these prices so high is they asked the United States civilians to ration, to where they had these stamps, as you can see pictured here, and they had the propaganda, as you can see to the left, and they said to the American people, okay, when you want to go buy certain items, yes, you'll pay with money like you normally do, but then you have to give over so many stamps. And we're going to issue these stamps to you occasionally, but once you run out of stamps, even if you have extra money, you can't buy any more of that good because you've ran out of stamps. And there were stamps for gasoline. There were different stamps for sugar. There were different stamps for any type of food item, that the fear was that there would be shortages, and so therefore maybe you had to limit how much each civilian was able to buy for themselves and their family, so that all of a sudden there wouldn't be these shortages and there wouldn't be these skyrocketing prices. So rationing is something I want you to put down in your notes. We'll do some small group activity here this week that'll cover some of this Homefront stuff more, but I wanted to give you a good heads up as to how rationing worked. And it's amazing how many of the American people actually went along with this request from the government to ration. The last thing here is if you didn't want to use up your stamps and if you didn't want to run out of stamps, you were encouraged to grow your own food. So this term Victory Garden started up, and that is where people would be told, hey, take your front yard, take your backyard, start to grow your own produce. That way you don't have to be always worried about how many stamps you're using and you're running out of stuff. You'll just grow your own food. And you'll be doing the patriotic thing by producing for your own family and for maybe your neighbors and so on. So again, a lot of this had a patriotic, propaganda-like message to the American people to do their part so that they could win the war. There's one more, I think, on there that talks about recycling, so you could just put scrap drives. And that is, a lot of young people were encouraged to go and find like scrap metal and go around their attics and garages, and if they could find any scrap metal, to bring it to a central location to where it could basically be recycled and reused. So that way the government could take that extra iron or extra steel and reuse it for war material. And today we just call it recycling, when of course now we have these blue bins and we have green bins, and you're encouraged to recycle. That's kind of what was going on during World War II for purposes of making sure that enough natural resources, especially the metals, were being used so that we wouldn't have to go and drill and mine for new iron, new steel, and so on. Well, now I've gotten to the part on the backside of my large group to discuss with you how minority groups and various minority groups were affected by the war. And the first group I want to talk about is, of course, African Americans. And so here's a quick little synopsis of what happens to black Americans at home during the war.
The journey of blacks into the workforce is a little longer and more complicated, but has an equally profound effect. Most blacks in 1940-41 are still living in rural areas of the South. And the war becomes the occasion for the second great migration of blacks from the rural South to the urban North and West, to centers of industrial production and military manufacture, to be hired in jobs that they had long been excluded from.
In fact, during the war, A. Philip Randolph threatened to have a huge march on Washington if you didn't do something about the segregation in the industries.
And he was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was an all-black union, and he is not satisfied with the speed with which jobs are being opened to black men and women.
For example, you had the Ford Motor Company, you had all of your automobile industries that now had been transformed into making equipment for the war, and black people couldn't get jobs there.
So one thing you want to make sure you put down in your notes is that when I told you that all these jobs are available because of the transferring from a peacetime economy to a war economy, that also meant blacks who maybe were still living in the South in large number started to move north to these cities like in Omaha, Nebraska, or Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, because there are these jobs in these manufacturing plants that they're hoping to then improve themselves and their families. And now they were discriminated against. They're working for less, and they're maybe only having to work jobs that are not desirable, like, for example, maybe your custodial jobs. But sometimes that was still better than what you were making if you lived in the South as a sharecropper. So it still was an improvement. And it's part of that second Great Awakening, or a continuation of that Great Awakening, that mass migration of blacks out of the South that had started during World War I. It's continuing during World War II. But here's one thing you want to add in your notes. Please understand that that doesn't always mean that white Americans were in open arms accepting all these blacks to these cities that maybe didn't have a lot of black populations living there before that. So there are going to be some racial friction, racial animosity that's going to emerge, because as these blacks move into societies in the north, these northern cities, they're going to be, of course, competing for the same housing as the whites. And they're going to move into neighborhoods that predominantly had been white neighborhoods, and that's going to cause racial friction because, of course, many in the white society are not going to live or not want to live amongst blacks, and so there's going to be some animosity there. One such famous story is a race riot that occurs in Detroit. I'm just going to show you some images. Here's some images of a white mob challenging blacks living in Detroit because of World War II and basically these competitions for both jobs and housing. And it leads to some dramatically emotional video and pictures of whites attacking blacks in Detroit as part of this story. Here's a picture of a black man beat pretty viciously by the white mob. And this is all happening during the war. As the war is being fought, you have that racial friction. Here's 1943 Detroit race riot. You can see the animosity. We want white tenants in our community. We don't want blacks moving into our neighborhoods. You can see overturning of cars by the white mob as part of their upset and dislike for what's happening amongst a now growing black population in a place like Detroit. And here you can see whites beating up on a black resident of Detroit. So it's just part of that animosity I want you to be aware of, okay? And blacks are going to start to mobilize. You could argue that this is the very beginning of the modern day civil rights movement that eventually becomes very famous with Martin Luther King Jr. 2 decades later. You could argue how blacks are being treated and being discriminated against starts the early part of the seeds of the modern day civil rights movement. Now that's just one group. I've got 3 more groups to do here in the next 8 minutes or so. So the next group is Mexican Americans. How are Mexican Americans affected by this World War II in the home front? Here's a quick little synopsis of what happens.
Mexican immigrants come to the United States by the tens of thousands, searching for work.
They would come in 2 ways. Mexican immigrants would come as undocumented immigrants. People would cross the U.S.-Mexico border surreptitiously and illegally in search of work, in search of a new life in the United States. They would also come with government assistance under the auspices of what was called the Bracero program. The Bracero program was an agreement signed between the governments of Mexico and the United States to send Mexican immigrant workers north to fill the labor needs of the U.S. during World War II.
All right, so the Bracero program, I have it spelled up there in the top right for you. Basically, it's an agreement between the United States government and the Mexican government to allow Mexican citizens to cross the border into the United States and work these agricultural fields and go from farm to farm in the American Southwest, harvesting the various crops because there was such a need for labor and not enough white labor to harvest all these crops. Mexican citizens were allowed to come cross the border and work in these particular jobs throughout the American Southwest. And many, many Mexicans will. And you could argue that what still is going on today with a dramatic increase in Mexico and Latin American immigration really starts here in the 1940s when the American government says, look, come to the United States, we need agricultural workers. But please also note, just like there was friction with black Americans moving to these areas, there's going to be friction with white Americans towards Hispanic Americans. The most famous is the Zoot Suit riots, where Mexican youth are going to get into fights with the white American sailors in places like Los Angeles. And white sailors are going to be competing for women when they're on shore leave, and these Mexican youth are there in these bars and these entertainment districts, and there are going to be fights. As one could probably guess happens when sailors are on leave, they maybe consume too much alcohol, they're competing for women, and all of a sudden they're going to get into fights. And who's blamed for this? A lot of the fights are blamed on the actual Mexican youth. Finally, though, there's Japanese Americans. And of course, they become maybe the more famous minority group that's affected by World War II because FDR is going to sign an executive order that says there's an American security problem with all the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast now that Japan has attacked Pearl Harbor and is at war with us, and we can't trust the Japanese Americans, so we're going to demand that they leave their homes, sell their businesses, and move to these camps. And so Japanese Americans are going to be sent to internment camps. Some of them are going to be racetracks where they're going to be housed in former horse stalls or apartments. They're going to be quickly built, and they're going to be forced to live there until the end of the war. And we're talking about people who are Japanese American citizens and first-generation immigrants. So I put Issei and Nisei. Issei is just first generation, which means you were born in Japan and came to the United States. But 2/3 of the 120,000 Japanese Americans are actually going to be Nisei, which means they're born in the United States, meaning they were citizens. And yet they are going to be forced to live in these internment camps too. Now, these groups were ones who lived on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington. If you lived in that exclusion zone, you had to leave your home and business and go to these camps. And there will be some political conflict that came out of this. There'll be a Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus United States, where a young American Japanese citizen is going to sue the government saying, look, you're violating my constitutional rights, but the Supreme Court will declare that what the government did was constitutional. And you might want to make a note of that. Korematsu versus United States, the Supreme Court declared that what the government had done, what FDR had issued, was constitutional, that it did not violate the Japanese Americans' rights. Still to this day, maybe one of the more controversial and dark Supreme Court rulings in our nation's history. But it is part of our story of how Japanese Americans were treated. So we quickly went through 3 groups. I'm going to end with this last group, and it's going to be very fast. Women. And I want you to put down married women join the workforce. Married women join the workforce in great numbers. 19 million women will join the workforce during World War II. Those jobs I was talking to you about earlier, high demand, there's a need for workers. And some of those jobs are now in traditionally male-dominated jobs on those factory assembly lines. But here's the thing, of those 19 million, 75% of them are married. That's the big change. Married women who used to just stay at home and be housewives and moms are now joining the workforce. And that's going to be a big, dramatic demographic change to the American labor force when these American women who are wives and mothers join in and get jobs. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget to take pictures of both sides of this handout and put it into your Google Classroom where your teacher has asked you to.